bum bum bum. Evening, everybody. It's Friday, 2nd of September, and unfortunately my youngest is upstairs with a whacking great temperature. So part of me is expecting her to wake up at any time, being very grumpy. The other half is hoping that she will actually stay asleep all night, nice and snuggled, and get better in the morning, because we've got quite a busy weekend. So, two tonight, because we've got some friends coming over tomorrow that are staying, so I'm not going to have time to do any drams tomorrow. So let's start with a pretty obscure brand of whiskey. I doubt you will have heard of this, particularly if you're in the UK, because it's very, very difficult to get hold of. It is, of course, Bell's, which is in the UK the biggest selling blended whiskey of them all, bigger than Grouse. Grouse, I don't think, is too far behind. I think it's a pretty close run thing, but certainly for a long time Bell's was the biggest seller. So I was actually donated a bottle from Mr. X, but in amongst all the miniatures that I acquired from my eldest daughter's school friends' parents, who basically gave me a whole heap of miniatures from a deceased relative, and some full-size bottles, and said, look, if you can sell them, brilliant. If not, we don't drink any whiskey. We don't really drink at all. Have them, do what you want with them. If you can get rid of them, brilliant. And if we can get some money from them, fantastic. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to, through one way or another, but it would still be nice to get rid of them at some point. I actually have a number of different bottlings. So I think this is the particular one that Mr. X donated. In a bell shape as a miniature, but this is quite an old one. I'm going to guess this is probably about 1970s, something like that. But in amongst the other bits that I've got a 21-year-old Bell's, which I didn't even know they did, Royal Reserve apparently, so I think that's a pretty rare one. I've also got a actual ceramic bell-shaped miniature. Now, Bell's is quite well known for their ceramic decanters, which they started doing in about the 1920s, 1930s, and they're particularly associated with the royal family. We used to sell Bell's commemorative decanters, one or two of them in the whiskey shop when I was working there, and it was a real niche market, but they were quite expensive. It was a 70cl bottle, but you were looking at 90, 100 quid, and it was still sort of bog standard Bell's inside it. So I'd be interested to know how much this ding 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 ding, whether it's actually worth anything, because it's a Wade. Is Wade a decent pottery? I don't know, but I'm going to have to do a bit of looking into this one to see sort of what the age is in terms of when this was made and whether there's any value to it. But I have a more recent one, which is this one. Now I think this is still 1980s. I think this is an 80s bottle, but the fill level is really good. I'm not particularly concerned. Maybe early 90s. So this is the one that I'm going to open, not the one that I got from Mr. X. Bell's itself. Who is Bell? It's Arthur Bell, who looks like this. And he joined a merchant's in Perth that was created, sort of established by a guy called Thomas Sandeman in the early 1800s. And he joined, Arthur Bell joined the company in 1837. And as seems to be quite common, particularly with blended whiskies, it was a merchants that began blending their own whiskies for their customers. And this is what Arthur Bell got into. He became a partner of the business in 1851 and then ended up taking it over. But his passion for whiskey and his willingness to sort of travel around Scotland and find, visit different distilleries and find different whiskies and really concentrate on quality rather than quantity gave him a very good reputation. And in 1895, he joined forces with his two sons, one of which was also called Arthur and the other was Robert, and established Arthur Bell and Sons Limited. And they began looking to export to the rest of the UK, but also overseas. Whiskey was becoming quite a big industry, already was a big industry, particularly getting over to America as well. He believed that you didn't need a brand name. So it wasn't called Bell's at the time, it was just called Extra Special Whiskey, because he believed that it was the quality of what was inside the bottle was what would sell, because word of mouth would begin to create the demand for his product. Now, he died in 1900, and Arthur Bell Jr. Took over the business, and the other son, Robert, essentially became a silent partner. Now, they became a private company in 1921. In 1933, they ended up buying the Blair Athol and Dufftown distilleries because they were becoming really, really big. This was not quite at the peak, that's more the 70s, 80s, but they were growing at a steady rate. And it wasn't until 1904 when it became known as Bell's Whisky, almost in honour of their father who had only recently died. So in 33 they were at the point where they needed to buy 2 distilleries to keep up with the demand for their whiskies. In 1936 they then bought the Inchgower distillery, and in 1942 both brothers died the same year. And the company was then run by their chief accountant, who was a guy called William Govan Farquharson. I mean, what a brilliant name. I assume he was posh as anything with a name like that. And he's actually credited in the history of Bell's with pushing Bell's as a brand even more overseas. They couldn't really match the budgets, particularly in the sort of the 50s and 60s of the bigger whiskey brands. And they didn't have the sort of the scale of money, advertising budgets, to be able to sort of advertise overseas. So what they started to do was, rather than talk about Bell's as a whiskey on its own, they started to talk about Bell's as a mixer. And this started to get a whole new market, which was predominantly women that weren't really whiskey drinkers, because advertising whiskey at that time was very much about masculinity and men drink whiskey. And Bell's was saying, we're a whiskey for cocktails, we're a whiskey for long drinks. You mix with soda and Coca-Cola and everything like that. And this was attracting a much bigger market. And in about the 50s, 60s, it's almost like 800% growth in the space of 10 years. It was one of those where they focused on a particular type of market and it clicked. And nobody else was looking in that direction at all. By 1980, they had a 35% share of the market in the UK of whisky sales, blended whisky sales. I don't think this is single malt, because the 70s, 80s was more about blends than malt whisky. So by saying 35% market share, that's predominantly blended whisky. So they were absolutely massive, and they were bought by Guinness in 1985 for 518. No, it said dollars, but I think it's pounds. Just over 500 million pounds. As part of all the process with Guinness, UDV, and everything like that, they are now owned by Diageo. And if you visit the Blair Athol distillery, which I have covered previously in the challenge, that is the Bell's. That's almost the kind of the spiritual home of Bell's. It's like a Bell's tourist attraction. It's not quite as bad as, say, the famous grouse experience at Glenturret, but you can't have a Bell's centre because it's not made in one place. But Blair Athol is the home of Bell's. So, as you can imagine, Blair Athol's a large constituent of it. There is also Inchgower and Dufftown, but they also have Glenkinchie, and Kalila is apparently in it as well, which is quite interesting, one of the Isla distilleries. I would assume that the grain that's in it is from Cameron Bridge, given that Diageo own Cameron Bridge and it's a massive factory. So now, this particular one, you might have known Bell's as Bell's 8-year-old. Whereas this particular one doesn't have the Bell's 8-year-old, it's Bell's Finest, but it's also got the extra special as a hark back to that. It's now Bell's Original. So over the years, and that's why I think this is 80s, maybe early 90s, before they went to Bell's 8-year-old, but they've now gone back to Bell's non-age statement, for want of a better word, in terms of it's Bell's Original. So when it said 8-year-old on the label, that meant that the youngest whiskey in there was 8-year-old and older, whereas before and after that, probably because of demand, they've now taken off the age statement, because that means you can have younger. So it's between 5 and 12 years old, seems to be the rough estimate of what the ages are in that. You're looking at Tesco at the moment are selling it for 14 quid a bottle for a 70 cl, but it's 2 for 20 quid. And to be honest, it tends to be on deal for a litre for 15 quid. It's when you get down to silly times like Christmas, where it was like 12 quid for a litre and things like that. It's the cheaper end, but it sells absolutely massively. Now, it's been ages since I've had Bell's, almost due to my personal snobbishness. My personal attitude towards Bell's in terms of massive brand, can't really be bothered with it. There've got to be more interesting things out there, so I don't really want to touch it with a barge pole. But it's, you know, it's in the challenge. And in all honesty, for Bell's, considering how big it is, considering the village where I live, probably half the village has got a bottle of Bell's. The fact that I haven't got the latest version of this, not really a letdown, because I've got this and I got donated an older one from Mr. X, and I'm absolutely grateful for it. But for something like Bell's, I really should be having the most modern version. But my assumption is that they've been pretty consistent with it through the years. It's such a big brand that they almost can't afford to tweak it and make it different, because it's at risk of losing a lot of money. So my guess would be that this one is going to be pretty similar to the Bell's that you would pick up off the shelf off Tesco. So what I also don't know is what the percentage is of malt to grain. So my guess would be probably 25% malt, 75% grain, something like that. Now, it's 40%, but apparently in some of the overseas markets it's actually 43%. But there is a slight spiritiness to it, but it's almost slightly like paint as well, in that, you know how paint's got a slightly spirity nose to it, but then it's also kind of thick, if that makes sense? It's kind of painty. And my guess is that, I'm assuming there's colouring in it as well, and there's a slight hint of that artificial plastic vibe that I always associate with cheap blends. It's not overpowering, it's not quite as bad as some that I've come across over the years. But there's not a great deal of softness to it. It's quite a hard nose. It's a bit tight and a bit hard, and it's not really soft and gentle and, you know, malt or toffee or anything like that. It's pretty rough around the edges. Having said that, it does develop, and it's not that bad. It's pretty well balanced, to be honest. It's got some bite to it. There is a bit more of a toffee edge to it. It's sort of slightly fudgy. There's not the paintiness that's on the nose. The palate's much preferable to the nose. It's not that badly balanced. There is a nice mouthfeel to it. It's a bit raw. It's a bit rough, but it's not harsh. It doesn't kick the back of your throat. It doesn't strip the enamel off your teeth. It's not particularly deep. There's actually not a bad... It's kind of orange, but it's almost like orange... You know, carrot cake sort of can taste a bit orangey as well, almost like it's carrot and orange peel in a cake. It's not too far off that. It's not got the buttercream icing that I love on carrot cake. It's just carrot cake on its own, where it's slightly nutmeggy, slightly orangey. There's a little bit of that, and it's actually not that bad. I wouldn't spend much time nosing it, to be perfectly honest. But on the palate, there's enough interesting stuff in there that it's perfectly drinkable, and I can see why this is really popular. It's got enough of a kick to it that it will work as a mixer, but it's not too rough, it's not too raw, but it does have an edge. But there's enough, not a lot, but there is enough soft mouthfeel and fruitiness to actually make it perfectly pleasantly drinkable. So if somebody does, in fact, the next time I'm in a pub, if I'm in a pub and they have Bell's there on the optics, I will actually give it a go. I wouldn't touch it at all previously. but I'd be willing to give it a go, because if it still tastes like that, it's not that bad. It really is actually a pretty decent, cheap bottom end whiskey. You know, like a bottom shelf whiskey, because it's the cheap stuff. And I can see why you get a litre of this for 10 quid at Christmas to share with the family, because if anybody drinks whiskey, they'll get by with that. You might be a bit of a whiskey snob and go, oh no, I don't want to touch that. But if you're really not that bothered, and it's Christmas, and actually you're probably going to do some cooking and put that in the Christmas cake, and then also have it with a Coke and everything like that, as a multifunctional whiskey, no issues with that whatsoever. So if you're watching this and you're a hardcore whiskey drinker, and you only drink single malts, or you only want to try anything that's over 20 quid or anything like that, or it has to have an age statement, or everything's got to be non-chill filtered, drop all your preconceptions and give it a go, because that surprised me. That's actually a lot better than I thought it was going to be. A lot better. And I'm not going to go out and buy a bottle, but I'm not going to turn it down if somebody offers it to me. And if it's the only thing in a bar that was available as a whiskey, yeah, I'll take it. Not a problem with that at all. Not bad. Miles better than I thought it was going to be perfectly honest. Good. Right, quick rinse out, and we shall crack on with another one. See you then. Cheers.